is also taken care of. So these are some of the issues which I thought I will flag. I look forward to a lot of interaction and a lot of ideas which I am sure will come up in the discussion that is going to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakti. Montek.
Thank you, NK, and Charles, congratulations on taking over as the head of the IEO. I mean, I know from personal experience that's a great job, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. You know, I know there are a lot of knowledgeable people here who want to ask questions, so I want to minimize the time I take. So let me just make 3 statements and perhaps comment a little on each of those, which are relevant. I mean, the first issue we need to consider is that do we need independent evaluation? And on that, I'm really quite unambiguous. We do. Now, whether an evaluation is good or not is a separate issue, but I'm glad that the IMF has an independent evaluation office, and I know that it is actually much more independent than any of the other independent evaluation units in the multilateral development banks. It's actually relevant for us in our own context because, you know, when you think about it, we have not internally had systematized independent evaluation. Yet, increasingly, the focus now is on evidence-based policy. I mean, you get a lot of discussion on it, and there's some reflection in the way our macro policies are moving, that common structures of thinking are being put in place. I mean, the Monetary Policy Committee, the various fiscal rules, and so on. But we don't have independent evaluation of how these structures are working. And I think that is actually a big missing link. Now, you know, earlier, the IMF used to think of itself as the world's central bank. And when all these other fellows had independent evaluation offices, they would say, well, these are all development financing organizations, and all countries have independent evaluation of the development work that they do. But they don't have independent evaluation of the central bank. And I mean, it's perish the thought. It shouldn't even be considered. But anyway, the global community felt that we need to have an independent evaluation office. Now, you know, in our case, we used to have in the old Planning Commission something called an independent evaluation unit. I don't think the new organization has one, but we do have the CAG. Now, the CAG has been broadening its remit beyond what one would call pure expenditure accounting to include issues of policy. It's not clear to me that they actually have the competence to do it. And that issue is being discussed. But it's not very clear whether you would want them to become an across-the-board source of independent evaluation. For example, we, over the last many years, I think former Governor Rangarajan once pointed out that the fiscal rules have been observed more in the breach. And that's for the last 15 years, since the thing came in. They get postponed, departed from, new rules imposed, etc. Now, we've never actually had an evaluation as to whether this departure from fiscal rules costs the country anything or not. Now, the sort of fellows who believe that fiscal rules are very important, if you let them loose, they will say it must have cost us, I don't know, 2 percentage points of GDP every year for the last 10 years or something like that. And that is a huge amount. Of course, it'd be interesting if the CAG were to do that and call it a scam, which is what they typically do, and it'll certainly attract attention. But I'm not recommending that that's what we should look at. But we do need some mechanism that would inform Parliament. And while clearly it happens as part of the macroeconomic reporting that the Finance Ministry does, that's not independent. I mean, there's been some talk that we should set up a fiscal council, for example, which would be sort of more responsible to Parliament rather than to the ministry. That would do some of this. So I think, and of course the whole issue regarding monetary policy, I mean, I know a lot of economists who firmly believe that if only we had lowered the interest rate at some point, I don't know how many percent of GDP would have come out of that. Now, this is again an issue where, rather than leave it to the pink press to decide, it's something that would be useful if one had some independent evaluations. Very tough to do. And this is I'm deliberately giving these exaggerated pictures because it's very, very tough to do a good job on this. But all I'm saying is we don't have it at the moment. So it's appropriate, while welcoming Charles and his colleague, to say that I think independent evaluation is very important, and countries that build it in only benefit from it. That's my first point. And incidentally, the IAO has produced some excellent reports, and those of you who are interested should take a look at them, including the very early one on what is the IMF's advice on capital account liberalization, and which established that although it was very clear that the IMF had a bias, they never actually advised anyone to liberalize the capital account. So it was reading between the lines. And I think that's an important point because 95% of people who comment on it believe that they go in there and arm twist everybody in order to liberalize the capital account. That was certainly not our experience in India. And I think it's useful that some of these things are put forward. And there are other reports, and particularly, I think both the Argentine crisis and the East Asian crisis, but more recently, and a much better report, I was associated with the earlier ones, so I'm just putting in a plug. But I think their report on the financial crisis is very, very good indeed. And the most recent one on Greece, I think will teach people a lot, and I'll come back to one or two of those points later. I don't think it's a big problem that the IMF didn't predict known crises, because what they should be saying is we predicted all the crises that didn't happen. Nobody can be perfect. And Stan Fisher, I think, had once said that, if you push that too much, then the IMF will be predicting 9 of the last 3 crises. And this is absolutely true, that, if a regulator is to be judged by whether he predicted something was going to go wrong, everybody on a ship would be saying there is a small probability that there's an iceberg out there which I can't check, but the next fellow better look out carefully. And that doesn't really help all that much. Second, I think this came up in what Charles said, this diversifying of the terms of reference. I think it's an interesting question to ask. Is it a good thing? My personal bias is it's not. I've reached the age where one likes to go back to the good old days, and I see a lot of other people of the same age here, so they can bear me out. It was a nice world when one said the IMF looks at stability and crises, and the World Bank looks at everything else. So in that sense, it had a narrow focus. It built a very narrow expertise, but it was the best expertise on that focus. Now, over time, this is not the fault of anyone, but it's happened, that naturally everybody wants a broader focus, and everything is interrelated. And therefore, talking about fiscal policy doesn't make sense unless you ground it in growth strategy, and that doesn't make sense unless you put it in the context of inclusive growth, and that doesn't make sense unless you make it sustainable growth, and then there's gender, and then there's climate change. Now, my very respectful submission is that the surest way of killing the IMF's credibility is to push the IMF to address all these issues. Not that they're not important, but it's like, if you're the guy who does the cardiovascular interventions, no point sort of saying, and by the way, I hope your knees are okay and that you've checked your liver also. There must be a system in which some people do something. And I therefore say that there's a danger in this diversification. And I fear, ever since the 1990s, the fund has been diversifying. So here is my recommendation for a future evaluation. Please address the question, is the loss of credibility because of the obvious dilution of competence and also the uncertainty about knowledge on these things worth trying to become more diverse? The truth of the matter is that there are enough people who know that, look, if you want to reduce the fiscal deficit, these are the choices. But if you put in also climate change, inclusion, gender, frankly, anything goes. So it's a bad thing to do, and I mean, it'll be interesting what other people have to say. Now, my last point, this sort of touches on what Shaktikanta also said, and that is, the fund is now seen more in the G20 summit meetings. Actually, I would read the history a little differently. Earlier, the IMF was dominant in the G20 finance ministers, because these things were all left to finance ministers. After the global crisis of 2008, the summiteers got into the act. Now, when they got into the act, of course, the IMF was there, but in a much lower role than it was when finance ministers were involved. The G20, as I recall, is very jealous to manage the agenda itself. And in the terms of reference, they say that we will be deciding what is good for the global economy, assisted by the IMF. In the days when the IMF dealt with economic policy with finance ministers, they were the centerpiece of the architecture. And I mean, the meetings were all presided over with the managing director playing a much bigger role. That is no longer the case. I think one of the issues here is, and something again that maybe Charles needs to think about, I had suggested at one time that the G20 should not ask for the IMF official view. In other words, the participation in the G20, in the Sherpas anyway, that is the people who prepare for the summit, the only people who go there, the G20 should be asking the IMF to lend its technical expertise to them. So the chief economist of the IMF should report to the G20. The views expressed there need not be the views of the management. They are the views of the technical body, which actually globally, if you go by qualifications and also in individuals involved, is a very, very superior group. The moment it becomes the view of management, it has invariably the political connotation. And I'll give you one example where I feel that this has actually led to a deterioration. And this is, again, something ICRIER could do as an evaluation. It has become a sort of a statement which everyone is willing to subscribe to. And the IMF has decided to subscribe to it. That in order to make sure that you don't get a crisis, you must have enough of your own reserves. That's reasonable. Then the second line of defense is regional reserve arrangements, and only the third line of defense is the IMF. Personally, I think that's wrong. I mean, there should be, ideally, even your own reserves. Of course, you have to have some reserves. But even your own reserves, everybody protecting themselves is like not believing in insurance. I mean, the whole point of the IMF is, I will have reserves for transactional purposes, but if I really need a lot of money, suddenly I go to the IMF. Now, you can change the tightness of the criteria for giving money under different circumstances, but let the IMF do that job. In a world in which the dominant interconnections were trade, we used to think about, we need 3 months worth of imports and 2 months worth of imports, and of course, during the 91 crisis, we got down to 1.5 weeks worth of imports, so that was clearly a problem. But in a world which is globally open, where you have huge amounts of foreign money invested in the country, and forget about foreign money, if it's open, your own guys can go out, by definition. Now, we are not that open because they can only go out to a certain extent. But even that going out to a certain extent has a negative impact, because if we allow $200,000 to be remitted every year, then you can be sure that most people, even when they don't want to hold it necessarily at that time abroad, will remit it abroad because then they store up a certain amount. So actually, if you really want insurance, you should have an IMF that people can rely on. The other side of that coin is that regional cooperation vitiates the nature of discipline. I mean, the entire Greek crisis, for example, would not have unwound the way it did, but for the fact that the IMF had to cooperate with the European Monetary Authority. And so, in a sense, if the European monetary chaps feel that this is the right way to do it and they're willing to cough up a certain amount of money, it's very difficult for the IMF to say, I don't think that's the right way to do it, so we're not participating. And the crux of the Greek crisis was that by any standard, the Greek debt, Greece was in the position that most of our farmers like to believe they are, which is that the only solution is write-off. Now, you know, it is true that at certain times, debt becomes essentially unrecoverable. The correct thing to do is write it off and then start again. The IMF was not actually allowed to do that. I don't know what they would have done. But the writing off the Greek debt really meant telling the European banks who had lent it that they must take the loss. So a kind of a constant recycling took place where these guys were able to get their money back, and Greece acquired more and more and more of other debt, including IMF debt. That would not have been the case if you didn't have a regional arrangement. Much the same thing happened with the Chiang Mai Initiative. I mean, the origin of the Chiang Mai Initiative was the East Asian crisis, because the Japanese actually felt that, look, they had just seen a crisis in Brazil, in Mexico, in 1994. And at that time, the amount of money required was so large that the Americans came in big time and the fund sort of supplemented that. And the Japanese knew that if something like that were to happen in East Asia, Uncle Sam was not going to come in, and it didn't. Nor did they think that the IMF would be able to come in quite easily, because after all, I mean, the Europeans and the Americans control it. So they said, what about an Asian monetary fund? In 97, that was a big thing. That huge opposition to the Asian monetary fund, mainly because I think the Europeans and the Americans much preferred that the IMF should be the source of money because they could ultimately control it. And the Chiang Mai Initiative was born out of it in a very attenuated way, and in a way which says that, look, we'll only lend to you parallel with the IMF. Okay? Now, this can go two ways. If the region doesn't have much strength, it allows the IMF to organize a program without spending too much money. If the region has a lot of strength, as Europe does, it allows them to say, look, these are the terms. Now you sign on the dotted line. And no managing director of the IMF would have been able to say no. So this is another evaluation. I put it harshly. The proposal is that the proposition that we should have an architecture which builds regional lines of defense is actually a negation of the real purpose of the IMF, which is to be the international lender of last resort. But thank you.
Thank you. We have some time left, I'll encourage anyone who wants to make any comment, ask any question. Floor is open. Yes, please.
My name is B.J.P. Sinha. I am from forestry profession. My question is that the climate risk is a real risk and real crisis. It's going to be a great disruptor. And it is mind that ecological crisis is never linear. It comes as a jump. So why Dr. Ahluwalia undermining the climate risk, and why IMF is not have adequate measure for evaluating the climate crisis?
Thank you. We will take a couple of questions. We'll club them together. Yes, please.
My name is Sabina Dewan. I'm executive director of a think tank called Just Jobs Network. And just picking off the last speaker's question, because Dr. Ahluwalia really was very provocative in saying you wanted to hear our views. And so I'm also going to express my views on the particular subject of the trade-off between the loss of credibility and the diversification of the IMF's portfolio. I think we live in a world now where megatrends from technology to climate change, the restructuring of trade into value chains is completely upending traditional employment, labor markets, governance systems, rule of law, and so on. And I think in light of that, as Charles mentioned, that the IMF does have a role to play in terms of using its influence to affect national level regulations and to try to nudge in the right direction, I think that's actually a really critical role that the IMF can play, and then the implementation can be left to, we're talking about labor, the ILO or the World Bank and so on. So I would express my views very strongly that I think that the direction that the IMF is moving in is actually very promising in terms of reinventing a governance structure for the 21st century. I loved your analogy about the cardiovascular doctor and the knees. If you have bad knees and you can't run, that has a real bearing on your cardiovascular health. So you might want to take a more holistic approach. And actually, if I may very quickly, to Dr. Das, I just wanted to ask you very quickly, I thought it was very interesting, your point about the cryptocurrency. And I'd be interested in hearing from you what how you would think about the regulatory structures at the global level and at the national level on sort of this imminent advancing of technology, cryptocurrency, big data, and so on. And what is the division between a multilateral institution like the IMF's role in regulating this onset of technology and the national government role? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, well, right at the back, the lady at the back. Yes.
Hello, this is regarding I'm Malabika Pal. I teach economics at Miranda House, Delhi University. Actually, this is regarding the question of diversification of terms of reference. I was doing my undergraduation and post-graduation during the 90s, and my MPhil was regarding the East Asian crisis. And that time, I think the IMF's role was very clear regarding being the lender of last resort. And as Professor Dr. Ahluwalia rightly pointed out, I think that role was very clear in everyone's mind. And over time, what has happened is that there has been a dilution of that role, and the social protection role has come up, as you have very in detail pointed out. But I want to ask you one question: that are the two roles of lender of last resort and social protection mutually exclusive? And if that is so, then what is your stance on being the international lender of last resort, considering the fact that there is no international lender of last resort at the moment? So is that a vacuum which is going to be left like that in a scenario, global scenario, where crisis is more frequent and more contagious and of severe magnitude, affecting millions of people across the world? So what is this terms of reference? That's what I want.
Okay, one last question we have time for. Yes, please. Or two more. Yes, please.
My name is Anand Gupta. I'm a former professor of economics at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. I have two questions, one for Dr. Collyns and the other one for Montek. Dr. Collyns, you talked about Greece and of course Montek also, but the role that IMF has played, what is the difference that you have made in Greece, And so far the question to Montek, I think we have an obsession with the issue of deficit. You mentioned fiscal deficit. But given the concern that we have with the macroeconomic implications, is it the fiscal deficit that we should be further, the way it is defined, or is it the public sector deficit, that is the deficit of all public entities?
All right. Lots of interest. Okay. Yes.
Mahendra Pal teaches economics in Delhi University. I think there are certain points. First, wonderful comment from Dr. Ahluwalia when he talks about this Group 20 and technical advice from the IMF. I think this is the right proposition. And the three additional points which I want to make to this existing discussion. One is threat from New Development Bank led by China to the Bretton Woods institution. This is the one point to be evaluated. And the second point, the Chinese currency as an alternate to as a reserve currency to the dollar. This is another threat. And even the IMF director also supports this argument. I don't know on what ground. And the third point, the Chinese currency inclusion in the STR evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, one last question now with the lady there.
Thank you very much. My name is Antara Lahiri. I work with the UNICEF on social policy. My question is to Dr. Collyns. Thank you very much for your remarks, and it's very encouraging to hear that IMF is in fact moving towards thinking about social protection in a much more coherent way. There are a couple of challenges that you may be facing in your path, one of which is recently I believe that in Mongolia as well as in Kyrgyzstan, you've actually advocated to get child benefits from universalization to targeted. So when you're sort of making these kind of policy decisions for countries, it might be helpful to have a very strong evidence base for the same. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Secondly, are you inviting other United Nations and international organizations to contribute towards this social protection sort of position paper that IMF is drafting, because we can then put in the evidence that we have to contribute to the same? Thank you.
Thank you. So may I now request Dr. Charles Collyns to make his responses very briefly in a minute's time.
Thanks very much. I mean, a lot of ground is being covered, both from the table here and also from the floor, and certainly it's been very helpful for us to take back a lot of the thoughts that we have heard. I mean, clearly the key unresolved issue is the one that Montek raised and that a number of you on the floor have raised, but coming from different points of view, is to what extent should the fund be focusing on the core competency, and to what extent should it be taking on a broader range of issues? I think that's unresolved, and I think it's going to be a theme that we're going to be looking at in a whole series of evaluations that we're doing. So, I mean, for example, the two evaluations currently underway on financial sector surveillance and unconventional monetary policy, these are very much in the core of the fund's traditional areas of expertise. But the question that we're looking at is to what extent is the fund actually providing value-added advice in these areas? Is there a risk that by paying more attention to these other issues, that there is some dilution of that core expertise, and that would certainly be a problem. So that's something, a theme that we're certainly looking at carefully as we go ahead. Specifically on the question on social protection, the example you raised of Mongolia, I think goes to the core of one of our findings, was that we don't yet see a coherent, consistent approach of being applied across countries. The IMF itself needs to do some more thinking about providing a more systematic view. The fund has committed to doing that work, and part of that work will indeed be listening to a range of external experts, including the United Nations agencies. So I think, in fact, those outreach efforts have already begun. If they haven't already begun, then they soon will. On the euro area crisis, there's a question of what was different about Europe, and I think the key point is with these European countries, the fund is only providing around a third of the total amount that was being lent to these countries, even though the fund access was far in excess of access provided to other countries. The fund was actually relatively small in the total package, and that meant that it was hard for the fund to follow through with technical judgments about debt sustainability and the need for debt restructuring. And that was the point that Montek was making in terms of the difficulties that the involvement in Europe with regional arrangements created. And again, this is an area that we flagged in our evaluation, where the fund is now doing some further work, further thinking about exactly how the fund does operate with these regional arrangements. Let me make one final point. As Montek says, all the regional development banks all have their evaluation offices. Well, what's interesting is that we're actually seeing evaluation offices now starting in some of the central banks too. So the Bank of England has a small evaluation office. The Banque de France is opening an evaluation office. The ESM in Europe has one. And we in the IO have been providing some advice and technical support for our new sibling organizations. And certainly if there was an interest in India in moving in this direction, I'm sure we'd be happy to give advice based on our own experience. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Montek, do you want to very briefly respond?
Thanks, Anke. Very, very briefly. Let me say that I'm second to none in sharing the view that the environmental threat is enormous. But as somebody said, that, you know, if you're having a heart attack, which is going to finish you off in the next 2 days, you do want the guy who's doing bypass surgery to not worry about your knees also. So it's a simple point. I do not think that the IMF can ever get the degree of competence needed to do a good job. Doubly so because some of these issues, which by the way are crucial, gender balance, for example, these are things that play out over a couple of decades. And there's no way that in the time horizon that they're supposed to look at, you can ever evaluate whether they did the right thing in that very short period of time. Now, the real question is, why not get the World Bank to do more of this? That is an extremely good argument, and I would be quite happy to dump whatever you want into an overall approach of the World Bank. They already take account of these things. They can perhaps have some method in which they say that, look, because of A, B, and C, and D, and your good behavior, we're giving you extra funds. I would be in favor of that. But remember that this, on climate change, the fundamental asymmetry in using the multilateral organizations is that you are focusing on a very small part of the pollution. Most of the big polluters are the US, Europe, China, and in due course us. By the time we get there, the multilaterals will probably have phased out their money. So actually you're not dealing with where the problem is. Do you want the IMF in its next World Economic Outlook, for example, to pronounce on what it thinks of the US administration's views on climate change? I mean, unless it pronounces on that, the credibility of what it says to anybody else is zero. So I'm making a very limited point. I'm with you. Let's tell the government of India, the World Bank, Niti Aayog, everybody that we need to do this, but let's keep the IMF out of it.
No, sir, very briefly. Now, this regulatory structure for cryptocurrencies, obviously you cannot have an international regulator for an activity like this. Each country has to devise, because there are already some developed countries who have recognized cryptocurrencies as legal. My personal view is that it should be declared illegal. What I was mentioning is that an institution like IMF needs to analyze what are its, what are the threats, what are the consequences, flag the issues, and also flag the policy options with regard to what kind of regulatory structure is required, or whether it is an activity which needs to be declared as illegal. So therefore, IMF needs to play that kind of a role, and ultimately decisions will have to be taken by individual countries.
Well, thank you. I have the pleasant duty of saying one or two words. Montek, I don't think Sabina perhaps meant that you did not need a knee replacement. Perhaps she meant that in orchestration after the bypass surgery, the same hospital being a multidisciplinary one, you can move on from the cardiac surgery onto the knee department and get your repair job done. But I think that we had a pretty fascinating discussion on the evolution of the Independent Evaluation Office. It's not very surprising that being the first distinguished evaluator of independent evaluator, you have rightly, Montek, come to the conclusion that an independent evaluation office has served a very useful purpose and has really demonstrated the ability of the world to be better informed. Not that it will be able to prevent any further crisis, much less predict where the crisis is taking place. And as usual, I think that in many of the core subjects of the International Monetary Fund, it may remain in the area of not preventing, much less predicting what is going to happen, but writing an excellent report at the end of it on why it took place. By the way, it reminds us of our famous institution, the Controller and Auditor General of India, about whom it is always said that all the action begins well after rigor mortis has set in considerably, and not in any way to try and prevent that degree of malfeasance, financial malfeasance, which may have taken place. But I think that on the broader issue of whether it should be diversified or it should be narrowly focused, I think that my sympathy really is that the fund would be, in my view, diluting its strength very, very substantially. And indeed, I think the G20 has already begun to dilute its strength very substantially, because the G20 emanated in the particular context. We had the G7 earlier. Because with each G20, the subjects with the G20 has concerned itself, it looks like a laundry list of more and more subjects being added to it without any focus on what the course of action is proposed or is likely to be. One little last point, and this point, Shakti, is addressed to you. You know, one of the fund's principal mandate has been an orderly and stable behavior of exchange rate. Now, to the extent that the next big study really is about the unconventional monetary policy, the fact remains that one of the most debilitating features today in the uncertainty which looms large is a crossover between orderly exchange rate management with the uncertainties which are surrounding the behavioral pattern of the unconventional monetary policy. The unconventional monetary policy, as mandates of most central bankers, are a mandate which is limited to country-specific circumstances. The consequences of unconventional monetary policy spill over into a wider international orbit. So is there a way in which we find that there can be a more meaningful role which the G20 can play in the days to come, where there is a more orderly behavior of individual central bankers driven by national mandate, but whose consequences spill over into the larger arena and a more disorderly management of what could happen to the exchange rate behavior? I think these issues, which require much greater synergy, may be the kind of areas which I think that the IMF should focus on if it is to be really true to its mandate of an orderly behavior of world trade, world growth through stable exchange rate management. But in the end, let me thank you, Prakash and Charles, for exceedingly thought-provoking and illuminating. I hope that what you have given to us, we can have the hard copy of that and then mull over that, because it has triggered ideas on a number of issues, including Montek, a very important one, which you said that we, or the world may be having, or the IMF may be having an independent evaluation office, but should we, in country-specific circumstances, also look to some kind of an independent evaluation which goes beyond the narrow confines of individual departmental concerns? There are lots of more questions which we had. There could have done more, but it's my very pleasant duty to bring this morning's discussion to a close and invite all of you to join us for lunch. Thank you.
Perfumery compounds, organic farming. Hi, that was very good.
Well, and Global?